finally the young pastor I was with, the Cuban pastor, said, "You're asking the wrong questions." He says, "Approaches we've made to better our country haven't worked. The real question is who can deliver us from this? And as a church, we have the answer, and that answer is Jesus Christ."
Welcome to First Person. I'm Wayne Shepherd, and today a report from Cuba as we'll talk with a veteran Canadian missionary who feels called to building God's kingdom in that communist-led country. Thanks for joining us for this week's conversation. Our goal is to talk with people from all walks of life who give us a perspective on how the Lord works in this world through those who love and serve Him. If you've never visited our website for additional information, I hope you will do that soon. At firstpersoninterview.com, you'll learn more about today's program. Plus, there's an audio archive of our past programs to listen to at any time and a schedule of what's coming up in the weeks ahead. It's all at firstpersoninterview.com. Well, today's guest has asked that I use only Dario as his name. I've known this man for several years and have taken 2 authorized trips into Cuba with him to witness what God is doing through the church, even in the midst of an oppressive communist government. As a Canadian missionary, Dario has taken well over 100 trips into Cuba, serving pastors and churches as he goes. So I don't know anyone who has a better view of what's happening spiritually in that country. We began, though, by talking about his call as a missionary.
Well, I worked for a number of years as a firefighter in Canada, and then I felt this tremendous burden to go onto the mission field, and we trained as missionaries with Christian Missionary Alliance, went into first Costa Rica to learn Spanish, and then on to Peru, where we were part of a team that planted a number of churches under the Encounter with God program. And then during that time, at the height of the Civil War with between Peru and the 2 communist factions, Sendero Luminoso and also Tupac Amaru were the 2 factions. Ministry was curtailed and for the most part shut down, and we knew we wouldn't have a public ministry there again. So God began to burden my heart with Cuba, and that happened in probably about 1989, 1990. And then when we returned home from the field because of heightened civil war right in the capital city, then we began to see God orchestrate and open doors for us to begin to become involved in ministry with, at that time, 56 denominations in Cuba, now up to 61. So wow. That all happened in the early 90s.
Well, I want to hear more about that, but let me take you back to Peru for a moment. You really came face-to-face with the violence there, didn't you?
Well, we saw, on one day there were 55 banks destroyed. Our family saw a number of assassinations. The head of the Peruvian Senate was my wife and children witnessed his assassination 5 doors down from our house. So our own church was infiltrated by a Shining Path, where senderistas came into the church, and so we were forced to withdraw from ministry, both by our own mission, but also by the national workers. Said it's too dangerous for you to be there. So we had to curtail our ministry there and began to ask God where next. And but that was, in those days, 25% of the land mass, or 25% of the population, and almost 30% of the land mass was under the control of either one or both of those communist factions.
It really has become almost a cliche that when God closes one door, He opens another, but that's what you experienced, isn't it?
For sure, totally, Wayne. And God began to give us a great burden for Cuba because we knew very little about it. We knew that it was a communist country and that the church had been curtailed and that there was very little growth. There had been a missionary movement, some 40 years before, but really it had become a national movement. Any kind of church growth was slow and curtailed. So God put the burden on, and we began to pray for 2 years to what seemed like heavens of brass. But then as God began to connect us with Cubans who were leaders at that time, then the doors began to open and we began to move into that country and what has become 20 years of ministry there.
Yeah, we're primarily interested in the advance of the gospel in Cuba, but let's just talk politically for a moment. Of course, Castro is still alive at the time of this conversation. His brother is in charge. What do you see happening politically? Are things getting better at all?
Raul's a different man than Fidel. When Fidel became sick with this intestinal disorder, and really for the next number of years, Raul stepped in 2008. But when he opens his mouth, you could hear Fidel speaking. Now, Raul's not the orator or charismatic leader that Fidel was, and he's already named his successor 4 years from now. But Fidel he's so sick he hasn't been seen publicly for some time now, and of course with Chavez out of the limelight, it seems like they are opening up more and more to international trade, and so things are changing in Cuba slowly. But hardship. There's two friends of revival or a great awakening in a country. One is hardship and suffering. The other is persecution. Mm-hmm. And the greatest move of God in Cuba was in the early 90s when Russia pulled back $10.5 billion of support, and the country had nowhere to turn. The people had nowhere to turn. They realized their politicians couldn't help them. And so over in those years, in that decade of the 90s, people were desperate for any kind of outside help. And I had a young leader asked, a pastor I had brought in, he was asking, why? Why is the average wage only $15 a month? And why is it that people have very little in the way of food or opportunities? And finally, the young pastor I was with, the Cuban pastor, said, "You're asking the wrong questions." He says, "Everybody knows why. The system is taxed. The approaches we've made to better our country haven't worked. The real question is who can deliver us from this? And as a church, we have the answer, and that answer is Jesus Christ." Yeah. And so at that time, in 97, Fidel Castro invited the Pope to come in and give the first religious ceremony in the country in over 45 years, and then a year and a half later, the evangelical church was allowed to have 22 evangelical celebrations in all of the major cities of Cuba, 4 of them broadcast on national TV, and that removed the fear from the people when they saw Fidel Castro in the Plaza of the Revolution in the heart of Havana, celebrating the Christian church and Christianity, and people began in droves to move into the church, and many coming into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And then the fear was removed, and the church literally exploded. So that's somewhat of the backdrop of how Cuba came to be one of the fastest growing countries for the gospel in the Americas.
So what is it like for the average Cuban now? There is much economic hardship and suffering, I know, but what is life like in Cuba?
Well, things are changing under Raul. There's a real limited free market economy. They would love to pattern themselves after China, but they don't have the resources. Things are very difficult. There's about 155 centrales or sugar refineries in Cuba, but 80 of them have been shut down. The equipment is antiquated and old, and sugar prices took quite a dip. Now they're starting to grow and become stronger. So during that time, Cuba was trying to find what could rescue them financially. They found huge nickel find in and around Moa. They've also probably maybe 4 years ago, they found huge oil reserves in the Gulf of Mexico. They're in the stages of developing that. But other than that, tourism has been the great economic savior outside of the mining, because it brings in cash into the country. the United States is one of Cuba's largest trading partners, and it's goods on the back end for cash on the front end. And so you have a lot of shiploads of fresh fruit and vegetables, chicken, those type of things coming into Cuba now, and slowly that embargo is diminishing, but it could still be another year or two yet before it's totally gone.
We'll continue talking with Dario and what God is doing in the country of Cuba, coming up today on First Person. Next time, a troubled teen in the 60s found the peace he was looking for.
I made bad choices because I was living away from God, but I see God's hand in my life. Even when I didn't know He was pursuing me, He was chasing me down, and I eventually surrendered to Him, and just an absolute amazing thing.
Rick McClary was seeking peace and a way out of Vietnam when he tuned into Billy Graham on television. You'll hear his story next time on First Person. Today on First Person, a look at the country of Cuba through the eyes of a brother. I'm calling him Dario. He is Canadian, and actually, we spent a couple of trips together in Cuba. It's been a few years now, but I've never forgotten that experience. I know things are changing all the time, but thank you, brother, for your heart for the church and what you've done. So many trips there that you've taken to help the church come alongside and encourage the church. It really is inspiring.
Thank you, Wayne. Cuba's been a country of great passion for me, and you see a country where the literacy rate is equal to Canada, the U.S., and more doctors per capita than any country in the world. Yet, fully two-thirds of all church planters and pastors are professionals. They're leaving their careers as doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, you name it, to become pastors and evangelists and church planters, and it's really taken the country by storm.
Well, Cuba is largely mysterious to us since there hasn't been a lot of information, especially when it comes to the growth of the church that you outlined earlier that took place in the 90s and since. But what is happening now in the church? What are some of the challenges facing the church in Cuba now?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the easing up on the embargo and Cubans now being allowed to travel. What that has caused is materialism is a great threat against the church, as you have about 1.3 million Cubans living in the United States of America, for the most part in southeast U.S., in and around Florida, but you probably have between 120 to 150,000 Cubans living in the New Jersey area up in the northeast of the U.S. So many of them are now allowed to come home. Before there was great restrictions on the amount of cash and goods that they could bring in, limited as far as technology, little in the ways of TVs and computers and cell phones. That's starting to happen now. But I think one of the negatives of all of this happening is that many Cubans now are leaving the country to visit family and then just not returning. The largest and fastest growing denominations are seeing an exodus of some of their leaders and pastors. And a dear friend of mine who was overseeing over 350 churches and another 600 to 700 house churches left because a family in Hialeah area of southeast U.S. and with his wife and family and hasn't come back, and that leaves a great vacuum in the spiritual leadership of the country.
Which is interesting because you certainly understand why they would want to escape the hardship there, but at the same time, it does take a toll on the church, doesn't it?
Huge. And we're seeing, I was just in to visit a number of church planters. We're supporting close to 400 church planters in Cuba. Many of them are lay leaders who have proven themselves while they're taking their seminary studies and preparation to become pastors. They are doing the work of church planting in every region of the country. They are literally, since the limitation of travel, where now they can travel anywhere in the country except for Havana, since that has been lifted, they're going into areas where the church has never penetrated before, and they're establishing churches and house churches. And now with the freedom to be able to buy properties and even vehicles, which is only a recent event within the last 3 years, now they're able to buy a property, move the family in there, and the living room becomes a house church. And there are literally in excess of, between churches, house churches, and missions, there is in excess of 23,000 churches, house churches, and missions throughout Cuba, much of it led and orchestrated by strong lay leadership who are preparing themselves to become pastors.
Yeah, I think a lot of people may be shaking their heads right now in disbelief. The numbers you're throwing out there, we have no idea really in the States that the church exists in those numbers there, and church planners exist in those numbers.
Much of it began in the birthplace of Europe in Cuba, which is in Baracoa. With a Pentecostal pastor. He basically sent out his first two workers, Alipio Pedraza, his name was. He was fighting against the communists in Batista's army, but as a Christian and a conscientious objector to killing people, he was trumped out of the army and became a pastor in Baracoa, a Pentecostal pastor actually. And he's really the father of the church planting movement, and in Cuba today. But it's now passed from the Pentecostals, and of course the Eastern Baptists are very strong. Western Baptists, there's a number of the denominations that are church planting. But we're seeing literally an exploding growth as it started with these first two church planters who received gifts of a handful of grain, rice and beans, and a chicken or two, and that was their salary. And then by faith, they moved ahead and took on 5. In the first year, they planted 5 churches, those 2 pastors, and then it just began to explode from there.
Well, when the full story is told someday, it's going to be exciting to hear. It
sure will be. It sure will be.
Yeah, God has given you such a unique vantage point there through numerous trips and great love for the people of Cuba. What are you able to accomplish? What are some things that we can learn about and pray about with you?
Well, right now, Wayne, the greatest need for Cuba is for Bibles. The Southern Baptists, Roy Cooper and some of the key guys working with the Southern Baptists have, I'd say in the last 4 years, have sent in 200,000 full Bibles, but they're nowhere to be found in the country. We don't know where they are. My suspicion is that they're being warehoused.
Yeah, once they get in the country, the government can decide what to do with them, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so we're really desperately seeking for the release of those Bibles, or if we have to print Bibles in the country. But again, as my mentor Garth Hunt used to say, any move of God, unless it's undergirded with the Word of God, dies out, and the fruit is lost.
Yeah, got to have the Word.
So there's a desperate need. Yeah. Desperate need for God's Word in the country.
All right, I know that you also have a great burden for marriages there, to strengthen marriages. Tell me about that.
Well, it started, we took a group out of Charlotte called Two Becoming One Ministries. Don Meredith and Sally Meredith are the founders, working for Gibbs Racing. He's a vice president for Gibbs. And they showed a great interest in going into Cuba. And I said, well, let's find out if the Cubans what their need is for marriages. So they went in, and Don and Sally had a tremendous heart for ministry. They literally broke down and cried about how their own marriage was on the verge of destruction until God raised it up and gave them a real heart for marriage ministry and for building the foundation of the church, which is the first thing God ordained was marriage. Mm-hmm. And Cuba has the highest divorce rate in the world at 75%, which is understandable because they're shipping over 30,000 medical doctors out of Cuba a year, and China has asked for another 20,000.
Is that right? Wow.
The machismo plays against it. There's no housing for new couples. There's a lot of things that play against marriage, and then it's been encouraged a loose lifestyle by the state. But we are going in next week to do our 17th marriage conference. We have trained Cubans. We have the books printed in country, Two Becoming One, marriage ministry. And it goes on all year long, whether we're there or not. But this will be our 17th conference of training leaders to train their own congregations and people, and then putting the tools into their hands to strengthen Cuban marriages.
Well, that's another lead to indicate to us how to pray for you and the ministry and for the Cuban church there as well. Dario, we have just a minute or so left. Make this personal. Tell me about a pastor, a family, a believer there that you think really illustrates how we can further pray for Cuba.
Well, I'm thinking of there's so many stories. But one story is of a young man who was being trained. This mother was with her. She was a single mom, had 2 kids, and was in an illicit relationship with the boss at the factory where she worked. He had a wife and 3 kids. And she became pregnant, so went to have the children aborted. They aborted one of the children, or they aborted the child, and she went back to work. Well, at 7 months, she continued to grow. The doctor did a checkup and realized they had aborted one of a set of twins.
Oh.
And so she went back to get the abortion, and they went into the theater where they do the abortions, aborted the child, threw it in the garbage, and took the mother out to get cleaned up. And the nurse went back into the room to clean up and heard this noise, looked down in the garbage, and it was this young boy sucking his thumb.
Oh.
And so she took the child out of the garbage, took it to the mother, and she said, "You've just given birth to a baby boy." And of course, the scandal of it all, she gave the child to her mother, the grandmother, to raise. Her mother was both a Spiritist and a Catholic, and she wanted the child raised in the Catholic Church. Long story short, she had him going to catechism classes, but was training him in Santeria. And on the way at 15, as he was going to get to meet with the priest to carry on his studies, he heard lively music. It was a house church meeting in a garage, went in, was miraculously saved, and today is one of those church planters. So you can retell that story thousands of times in the lives of the Cubans, and that's just what God is doing to raise up the church and house church movement of Cuba.
It may seem a little strange to you that we didn't use a full name for our guest today, but although his work and travel to Cuba is completely on the up and up, we decided not to do anything that may curtail the ministry. He did agree to today's interview, though, because the story of God at work in Cuba needs to be told. We won't be able to put a lot of additional information on our website, but you will find my contact information there, and you can email me if you do need additional information and a link to Dario's ministry in Canada. Look us up online at firstpersoninterview.com. Again, firstpersoninterview.com. Or if you prefer, you can view us on Facebook and leave your comments there at facebook.com/firstpersoninterview. Today's program will be archived on our website. Just click on the listen button to play it again. Or you can subscribe to First Person on iTunes at no charge and receive each week's show as a downloadable podcast. Search for First Person in the podcast section of iTunes and subscribe free of charge. Next week, you'll meet Rick McClary of the Light Radio Network, who will share his personal testimony of coming to the Lord in the turbulent 1960s. I hope you'll join us next week. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. We'll see you next time for First Person.